You know, you look in the Bible and there's all these pagan practices in there. Doesn't that mean to tell you that it was actually the pagan influences that caused us to have our Bible? That they're just copies of pagan stories? Well, hold on a minute. Not so fast. Let's talk about this. I'm Methodist Dave. I'm a professional theologian and teacher of the Bible, and we continue on our study of the life of the patriarch Abraham. And chapter 15 of the book of Genesis brings us to a very interesting incident in Abraham's life. And if you don't know anything about ancient Near East history and customs, then this whole passage here is going to sound really, really weird. Abraham, whose name means father of a multitude, is 75 years old and he's childless. God has promised him that he's going to be a great name, that he's going to have a large population, a large group of descendants, and that the land that he's dwelling in will belong to his descendants forever. But Abraham doesn't have any kids right now. And he says, you know, I'm childless. You've made these promises to me. And if I were to die now, the only heir to all my possessions would be my servant Eliezer of Damascus, who would have been a slave, an enslaved person of Abraham, not in the way that we would see slavery, but he was still the property of Abraham, but as the probably oldest of these servants born to Abraham's household, given a lot of responsibility, could have actually inherited and could have been adopted as an heir for Abraham. So Abraham's not having his own children, and God's like, relax. I'm going to give you an heir. But I want you to do something. And God lists off these names of these animals. And Abraham takes these animals, kills them, and cuts them in half and lays them down on the ground. Now we have to understand that God is always going to relate to people in a way that they can understand. And in Abram's day, if you wanted to enter a covenant with somebody, this is what you would do. You would take a group of animals, cut them in half, put them down on the ground in the shape of a pathway, and you and the person you were entering a covenant with would walk together down the middle of these dead animals. Now, we're familiar with contracts, and what every contract has, and if you are writing the contract or you're having a contract, if you're the signee or the signor, you are going to have in your contract an out clause, an escape clause. And it's a way for you to back out of the contract. If something should happen, it's allow you to get out. A covenant is something different. When you make a covenant, there is no escape clause. Now, in this custom, in this day, that you would put these animals on the ground, you would make a vow together, and you would walk between the animals. And the understanding was that if either one of you broke the covenant, then the other person had the right to cut you in two, just like these animals. Pretty intense, huh? But that's the culture of the day. This is something that Abram would understand, that he is entering into an irrevocable promise with God, that God is promising him an heir and the land. So by walking together with Abraham between these dead animals, then God would say, this will happen, and Abraham would have confidence. However, it doesn't go down the way Abraham thought it was going to go. See, God delays, and it becomes late, and Abraham gets very sleepy, and he kind of like falls into this drowsy, dreamlike state. And he can't move, but he can see what's going on. And then there's a flaming torch. This is a manifestation of the presence of God, that God didn't look like a torch. It would look like a flaming torch, like a ball of fire, like a globe, a glowing orb of something like that, moves between the dead animals, as God says, I will give you an heir, and I will make your name great, and I will promise this land to you and your descendants forever and ever. And God passes between the dead animals. And Abraham doesn't. This is a unilateral contract, which means the only person who is obliged to keep their word is God. God didn't allow Abraham to go through this contract because Abraham may not have lived up to the terms. If Abraham failed, then God would have to take his life. So God does it by himself. And Abraham is the recipient of the covenant, but he's not a participant in the covenant. This is God's action, and God alone is responsible for making everything come out right. Later on, God is going to use a suzerain treaty when he deals with the nation of Israel as they have left Egypt and come into the wilderness, and God is going to make a treaty called a suzerain treaty, and it's a treaty that they would have been familiar with. And that is a reciprocal contract. If you do this, then I'll do that. And if I do this, you'll do that. And if you don't do this, then this will happen. So it's a contract or a deal that has expectations placed upon it. But it would be something that the people were familiar with at that time, which is why God uses it. Later on in the New Testament, Paul is going to speak a lot about the subject that we are adopted, that we become heirs, that we are adopted into God's family. And Paul uses this language because the people of his time would be familiar with the Roman practice of adoption. You would adopt your own children, that you would actually have to acknowledge them and then not just have your children, but you would make them your legal heirs. And you could adopt anybody into your family and supersede your biological children. Pretty interesting. In the movie Ben-Hur, the central character is adopted by the Roman tribune who makes him his son and the heir. So he gives him his signet ring, and he's legally his son, even though he's not his son. So we see that God relates to people in a way that they can understand. Now, one thing that we like to use in our modern culture right now is that word relationship. You need to have a relationship with God because we're all busy having relationships with each other. You know, the church is called the bride of Christ because we understand what marriage is like. Not so much anymore, but that's why the word marriage, that the church is considered the bride of Christ, because we understand what marriage is and what being a bride expectations are. So we can see that God will relate to people throughout history at different times in different ways. And some of their cultures, some of their customs that sound really, really weird to us make perfect sense to them, because in our next video, we are going to have the sordid story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And if you think soap operas have anything on the Bible, man, you ain't seen nothing yet. That's all for this video. If you have any questions about this subject or any subject, feel free to drop me an email, methodistdave@gmail.com. Like the video, share it with your friends, and I will see you on the next one. And remember, be good to one another. Bye-bye.